Biden destroyed the border on his first day in office, on Inauguration Day. One of the worst things about this crisis is the cover-up of the hundreds of thousands of crimes that these people are committing.
Welcome to No Border, No Country. Joined by Judge Matt O'Brien. Matt, we've got a guest today who's done a lot of work over the years, David Horowitz. What do you know about him?
Well, David's a really interesting guy. He was raised in a family with two communist parents. People who are in that situation call themselves red diaper babies. And he was part of the group of people that created the New Left in the United States. And he was very involved in fundraising, message spreading, all those kind of things. And he recruited a good friend of his, a woman, to do bookkeeping for the Black Panthers. And ultimately, the Black Panthers raped and killed her because of some perceived slight against the Black Panthers and their cause. And at that point in time, Mr. Horowitz woke up and said, I think the fact that they were able to do this to someone that they called a friend and an associate has less to do with criminality overall than it does to do with their worldview. And he had what on the internet is called a red pill moment and became a conservative and became a very staunch advocate for the right. He's been the author of a number of fantastic books. He wrote one about the Cultural Revolution in the 1960s called Destruction Generation. He wrote a fantastic book called Unholy Alliance, which talks about the bizarre alliance between the hard ultra-liberal left in the United States and the Islamofascist jihadist terrorists in the Middle East, and analyzes why there's a connection there. So a very fascinating guy, a lot of background in politics in general, and in particular, a lot of background in conservatism in the tail end of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st century. So this should be an interesting interview. Anyone
who watched cable news a lot in the last 15 years or so, he was a regular on many shows, and he's written a lot. It seems like the thing he's done the most that I've seen was the following this kind of campus radicalism. But as we're going to see in the book that he's got out now, he really goes across the board and talks about what's failing this country right now.
Yeah, he does indeed. And he's been a strong advocate of the positions that Early takes on immigration. He's written a lot of stuff that you can find in the archives at townhall.com about immigration in particular.
Today, our guest is the author of The Radical Mind, The Destructive Plans of the Woke Left, Mr. David Horowitz. David, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Okay. We wanted to talk about your book in general, but also to kind of focus on the immigration aspects of it. So we have millions of foreign nationals illegally entering our country now. We have politicians allowing them to vote in local elections. We have wages down and crime is up. American citizens believe we're being invaded. How did we get here?
Well, we have a criminal and a traitor in the White House. That's how we got here. And a whole party that supports him. And another party that likes to talk about him being compromised. Look, Biden destroyed the border on his first day in office, on Inauguration Day. He undid, I don't remember the count, whether it's 25 or 42 reforms that Trump put in place to reduce immigration to its illegal immigration to its lowest levels. Joe Biden has no authority to change the immigration laws. His authority stems from being the chief executive, which is to enforce the law. We live in a lawless country now because the Democratic Party is a lawless party, and Republicans are too timid to hammer that home effectively. Hopefully they'll squeak through this time. So we have an unconstitutional, not only is it an unconstitutional decision to destroy the border, to change border policy through the presidency. But Barack Obama said this 20 times on television, or 22 times, we have the records of it, saying that the Constitution does not allow me. I mean, I would like to change the immigration laws so all the DACA people could get in, but I can't do it because the Constitution prevents me from doing it. And then he went ahead and did it, and the Republicans let him get away with it. That's how deep in we are. One of the worst things about this crisis is the cover-up of the hundreds of thousands of crimes that these people are committing. I know this because I stumbled on a government report, GAO report, in 2018, which was a study of the number of illegals, invaders, I like to call them, in our jails for serious crimes. And it turned out that there were 770,000 illegals in the U.S. prisons for committing serious violent crimes, 1 million drug crimes, which have taken the lives of hundreds of thousands of young people. Well, that's what you get when you turn the border over to the Mexican cartels in China. I don't remember the exact figures. The 775,000 crimes, arrests, that's the number of people in prison, were for committing 4.9 million crimes, because it's catch and release. So just as they release them at the border, well, they don't even catch them at the border, but if they do catch them, they release them. So it's a massive crime wave that nobody mentions. And the magnitudes are left in the background. Here's a thought that occurred to me the other day, that Joe Biden, by destroying the border and killing effectively 80,000 young people a year through fentanyl poisoning, is responsible for more innocent American deaths than Hitler. And I know Hitler's an inflammatory term, but it's true. We lost under 100,000. Well, the total in 4 years of war, I guess, 5 years of war, was 250,000. We're getting that many border crossings a day. Oh, a month. I'm sorry for smiling, but this is so gruesome. You have the Democrats, when Trump was in office, we had the lowest illegal immigration rates. He tried to go even better and deport these people who should never have been let into the country in the first place. It's because our laws don't permit you to jail children with their parents if their parents have committed crimes. There were 4,000 children total, 4,000 left in the custody of U.S. Border Patrol, civilized people. The Trump crew went crazy. They're just gangsters, and there's no genuine emotion that they have. These are the most immoral people that have ever run this country. Shockingly immoral, I should say, from someone who's been observing politics pretty closely for 75 years. The Biden comes in and invites unaccompanied minors to come into the country to go on one of the most dangerous treks there is through these South American jungles and deserts and whatever the hell else, under the tender guidance of ruthless criminal cartel members. who raped them and, go through all the horrors. And within a year, there weren't 4,000 children who were temporarily being held by Border Patrol, but there were 250,000 that just disappeared into the country to be put in these, to do in these child exploitation factories, to be sex trafficked and so forth. The most horrific crime in the history of our country against our own people. Joe Biden and all his supporters are responsible for that.
So can you put this into context for us? I'm a huge fan of your books. I particularly like Destruction Generation. And one of your themes has constantly been that the left is out to destroy all of the institutions that make America great. So how does immigration fit into that plan?
Big blind spot for conservatives. They're very too civilized, too genteel, too ready to give the benefit of the doubt to people who want to kill them. I was raised by communists. My parents were very nice people if you didn't cost them politically. But they were just school teachers, and they were very law-abiding citizens. A lot has changed since the 60s. These are not law-abiding citizens, and their criminality is encouraged by the Biden administration and the Garland Department of Justice that won't prosecute them. We live in a lawless land, and it's lawless because the Democrat Party refuses to enforce the law as is their responsibility. But the radical mentality, it begins with thinking that people are good and society makes them bad. Conservatives, usually coming from some religious tradition, and this country was built by Protestants. Protestant Christians were 98% of the settlers when the founding took place. I actually had just written another book about this subject, that the genius of American political life is Martin Luther, a Catholic monk who sparked the Reformation. Understanding that we're the problem, not society. There is no such thing as society. The social justice is what? It's Biden handing out to his political donors and cronies money that he's taken from the rest of us. There's nothing just about it, and it's just bribery. You can't expect the world to be transformed by the people who created the world in the first place. That's the big thing that leftists don't understand. Whereas if you're a properly religious person, and I'm an agnostic, I could say, this is an appreciation coming from an agnostic whose eyes are open. If you come from a genuine religion, you understand that people are the problem, and therefore they can't fix the problem. And so you have a view of limited government and orderly whatever it is. That's the great divide.
So, Matt, we heard some of those opinions of David Horowitz there. He's really studied these issues closely, obviously, from his work. How would you sort of synthesize what he's written here about immigration?
Well, I think that he has made the point throughout all of his books that the fundamental institutions, fundamental things that make us American and that mark our way of life, liberty, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, all of the basic things that conservatives hold close to heart are under fire from the left. And the left's stance on immigration, open borders, forgiving everyone who violates the immigration laws, giving asylum to people who are actually economic refugees, not political refugees. This is all part and parcel of this plan that the left has to undermine the American way of life and to gain control of the United States so they can start to implement more and more socialist forms of government. And I think one of the interesting things that Mr. Horowitz has brought up over time is, where are all these migrants coming from? A lot of them are coming from places that either have overtly Marxist governments, or they're coming from places that have been locked, like Colombia, in mortal combat with the Marxists for decades. And so you have people that are showing up here and they're not going, where you're poor, you're tired, you're huddled masses yearning to breathe free. They're showing up with iPhones and Nike sneakers and then saying, I want more, Uncle Sam needs to give it to me. I mean, perfect example, I had a woman in court when I was an immigration judge who had a utterly bogus asylum case. I mean, it was clearly manufactured. It was fraudulent. And so I ordered her removed. And when I got finished reading the decision into the record ordering her removed, she stood up and started yelling at me and said, well, who's going to take care of my disabled son now? Her disabled son, who was not born in the United States and who wasn't so disabled that she wasn't able to walk from like Guatemala or El Salvador with him. So I think one of the really important things that David has done for political thought in the United States is he has clarified what the hard radical left's aims are. He has pointed to the specific tactics and techniques they're trying to use to undermine our government, our systems, our way of life. And in particular, he's identified unchecked mass migration as one of those tactics and techniques.
It seems like, even though we've talked a lot about how the left, they don't particularly like immigrants from Cuba or maybe Venezuela since they went socialist, the rest of them, in particular the Northern Triangle, it seems like they've been pre-indoctrinated into authoritarianism, so that for however many of them may rebel against it, there's probably a good amount of them that are going to depend on it and look for it when they get here.
Yeah, I think that's true. And actually, I think the left pretends that it's dissatisfied with people from Venezuela and Cuba. I think the model that the left wants to implement in the United States is a Venezuelan and Cuban model. And what they're afraid of is not that the Venezuelans and Cubans are too Marxist. That's just a smokescreen. What they're afraid of is that the ones that are coming here are not Marxist enough. If you talk to your average Cuban on Calle Ocho in Miami, I used to live in Miami and work for INS back when it was still the Immigration and Naturalization Service there. Cubans were unbelievable. You mentioned Fidel Castro's name and they turned their head and spit on the ground. And then, if you said anything about communists or Marxists, the reaction was, comunistas. And very, very traditionally conservative group of immigrants. And that's one of the reasons that Miami went from being, kind of a not particularly fantastic tropical port city to a place that was plagued by crime in the 60s and 70s to like one of the major tourist destinations in the world, in the 80s. That was, some of it I think was attributable to Miami Vice, Crockett and Tubbs, but I think the vast majority of it was attributable to the efforts that the Cuban immigrant community put into making Miami a better place to live and avoiding like the plague anything that remotely smacked of communism or Marxism.
Do you think that the anti-borders movement, we know they're patient. They're willing to wait. They play the long game. Mm-hmm. The anti-communist ethic among a lot of Cuban refugees, has it translated to the subsequent generations as much? Because the ones who came here from Cuba, clearly they were staunchly anti-communist. But as their children and their grandchildren become more accustomed to the American lifestyle, they may go to the public schools, they can get indoctrinated there, or social media. Is that part of their strategy? Maybe we'll wait out that first generation or maybe even the second one, but we'll get them in the long run.
Yeah, that's definitely part of it. I mean, that's part of the multi-generational strategy. And what happens usually is if you have a place with a real honest-to-God totalitarian dictator, the people who are going to escape, and they get to someplace safe like the United States or Canada. Then the dictators get smart and shut that off. So the first wave of the Cubans in the 50s and the early 60s through the Bay of Pigs were people who are extremely conservative, extremely democratic. The people that came afterwards were the people from the Mariel boat lift, which if you think back to the movie Scarface with Al Pacino, he was supposedly what they referred to in Miami as a Marielito. And the reason that was chosen as the plot of the movie was because Castro went, oh, well, the Americans are going to let all these people into the United States because they're supposedly refugees from my style of government. He said, I'm going to fix that. And he emptied the jails. And so most of the people that came during the Mariel boat lift, there were a lot of wonderful people, a lot of good, hardworking people that managed to get out during that period. But a lot of the people that were released from the jails in Cuba were murderers and rapists and bank robbers and thieves who, then wound up in the United States, were not admissible, were kept in administrative immigration detention until in an extremely misguided Supreme Court decision in the late 90s, the Supreme Court found that it was unconstitutional to keep them in administrative detention. There's a brilliant dissent in that case written by Antonin Scalia, where he said, I find it difficult to believe that people who have no right to be in the United States at all have a right to be at liberty in the United States if they can't be deported to their home country. And so, this is the crazy stuff that goes on. And I think David Horowitz, his insight on this is interesting because he was in the belly of New Left communism. He was working side by side with people from like Students for Democratic Society, the Black Panthers, all these other extreme leftist groups that in a lot of cases were receiving training and funding from the KGB. And, he eventually recognized it for what it was, which is a movement to destabilize the government of the United States.
I'm Tom Homan. The Biden administration is reversing America's progress on immigration, reversing ICE's ability to deport criminal illegal aliens, reversing job protections for Americans, and construction of the wall. That's why I've joined EARLY, the Immigration Reform Law Institute. EARLY uses the courts to stop bad immigration policies. Join me. Support EARLY at early.org. Help win the immigration fight in the courtroom. Paid for by the Immigration Reform Law Institute.
So, Matt, you've talked before about your trip to Israel last summer. What can you glean from that experience, given what's going on now and just the state of border security in the Middle East?
Well, this is interesting. So David Horowitz has been a big advocate of Israel for quite some time and has been very vocal about how the Israeli situation has certain parallels here. And one of the things that he has always said is that when you are running a country that has enemies, you want to keep the enemies out. One of the major functions of your immigration system is to keep those people out. I think there's been a lot of debate about walls after the Israel situation, but what we saw when we were in Israel is that walls work and the U.S. should have one. The Israelis put those walls up, not so much because of a desire to keep traditional armies like the Jordanian or the Egyptian army out, or even to defeat the kind of terrorist attack that we saw on October 7th of 2023. It wasn't something that was designed to be a strategic military hedge against mass attacks. What it was to prevent the infiltration of onesie-twosie groups of terrorists who were trying to set up cells in Israel. And it was designed to stop the infiltration of organized crime into Israel, which is largely used to support terrorism. So Hamas and all of the other terrorist groups, the Al-Aqsa brigades and so on and so forth, that are working throughout that area, have organized crime entities that are attached to them that do things like smuggling, prostitution, gun running, all of those kind of things in order to earn a profit. And Israel is surrounded on all sides with groups like that. There's Bedouin smugglers in Egypt that take people across the desert into Israel. You have groups. I worked when I was at DHS on a massive investigation where they had people getting stolen cars, packing them full of prohibited technology like binoculars and rifle scopes and things like that, and then shipping them all to Lebanon, where they were then funneled to people who were terrorists. And for people that haven't been to the area, Israel is about the size of New Jersey, and it's probably only about 50, 60 miles across at the widest point. So when you are at the border with Lebanon, there is like a significant border for a small country where you're driving along Israeli roads and you are right next to the border looking into Lebanon. Same thing is true when you get to Jordan and Egypt. Now, Israel's had fantastic relationships with Jordan lately, so there's not much of a fence there. But the rest of the borders they have physical barriers. There's walls, there's fences, there's high-tech equipment. And, that resulted in about a 85 to 95% reduction in the amount of terrorist activity in Israel. So I think, the things that David has talked about in his books, like you really need to deport people that are threats to your country, and you really need to be vigilant about not letting them in, are important, and Israel provides a good example of that.
You spent many years working in the federal government on immigration. Given what we saw on October 7th last year, would our Border Patrol be equipped and ready to handle a similar kind of attack on our southern border if they sent an army of paragliders across the wall? Would we be ready for it? Could we handle it?
No, and we actually have had problems where the Mexican military working with the cartels has outgunned the Border Patrol. In some cases, outgunned the Border Patrol backed up by National Park Rangers and Bureau of Land Management law enforcement officers, and sometimes Department of Agriculture law enforcement officers. The U.S. border, it's interesting. Territory-wise, geographically, it's very similar to the border with Israel. If you're standing on a lot of these border points in Israel, it looks very similar to the coast in San Diego, and the desert parts look very much like Texas, New Mexico, Arizona. What's different about the situation is that the Israeli borders are very tightly fenced off, and they're patrolled by the Israeli military. In some cases, they're patrolled by the Magav, which is the Israeli Border Patrol. But that Border Patrol is a gendarmerie unit, meaning it serves a police function, but it's actually part of the Israeli Land Army. And they are backed up in a lot of places where the terrorism or the threat of, say, an Egyptian or Assyrian invasion is more significant by combat units of the Israeli Defense Forces. So we have a different situation. We have the border being policed by civilian police officers in the form of Border Patrol agents and U.S. Customs and Border Protection officers. And while they do get some training in how to, deal tactically in the desert and shoot long weapons and things like that, they're not military people. And the U.S. has had situations along the border that are similar to those that were encountered in Israel. In the period around the same time that World War I was taking place, of course, we had to dispatch General Blackjack Pershing along with several units of the United States Cavalry to go secure the border against he's frequently referred to as a bandit, but Pancho Villa eventually became the president of Mexico. He was the head of an organized crime group that then became a political revolutionary group and then eventually seized power in Mexico. And so, that hasn't happened since 1915, but there's nothing to indicate that it won't happen again. And a lot of the very same forces that are active in Israel are becoming active in Latin America. There is, I believe, an Iranian Revolutionary Guard Quds Force base in Venezuela. Hamas and several of the other Islamic terrorist groups have been active in South America. There is some indication that they have been paid to provide training to local terrorist groups in Latin America, and that they were in return given training in how to sell and transport drugs. And so there's a big connection between organized crime and terrorism. Israel is the laboratory where aggressive solutions to those problems have been tried. And in most cases, they've been about 99% successful, which is why Israel should be an example, and the policies that it uses should be an example to the United States. And of course, the other issue with Israel is it's a democracy like the United States. So these decisions that are being made about how to deal with these issues in Israel are made by elected representatives of the people. They're not made by dictatorial personnel acting unilaterally. And that's how decisions are supposed to be made about the border here in the United States. But, I think you would probably agree with me that successive administrations, both Democrat and Republican here in the United States, have, you got a piece that should be published soon that I just recently read saying that, people are selective. I think your term was a la carte immigration enforcement. Political and civic leaders are enforcing the immigration laws that they find convenient, but the ones that don't jive with their political ideologies are not being enforced. And perhaps the most interesting thing about Israel is that extreme left, extreme right, and everything in between, everybody is on the same page about immigration enforcement and barriers, with the exception of a few fringe groups here and there. You do have some ultra-Orthodox Jewish people that think that Zionism is bad. I don't quite understand the philosophy behind it, but they exist. But generally speaking, everybody is on the same page about the sovereignty and border integrity issues in Israel. Here, I think a lot of us have the impression that there is a globalist anti-borders crowd that is actively trying to undermine the sovereignty of the United States. We were recently in Israel to look at the border defenses with the IDF. A number of early staff members went there, and we prepared a report on it when we came back. Israel has effectively used walls to protect itself. Why wouldn't a wall work on the southern border? The left seems to hate the wall, and yet everywhere they're put up.
Why was the Israeli population unarmed? Jews have a reputation for being smart, but they also have a pretty big reputation for being stupid. Why didn't they expel, after the 48 war, they should have just expelled every Arab from the area. There were little weak countries surrounded. They had been attacked by 5 Arab dictatorships. Just get them out, just for security reasons. Or after the Yom Kippur War, why not expel them?
So what's the solution here in the United States? Is it to enforce the laws and deport all of these people that are coming?
Pay every federal dollar that Harvard has that's not being used to make bombs or do something useful or vaccines. Just defund all the liberal arts schools in the country. So take away all their federal funding until they get faculties that look something like American. You want to know why the media is so bad? They did a study a couple of years ago, I forget the group. They studied 2,000 communications departments. It used to be the journalists weren't college educated. They just reported what they saw. But now they're all college educated, and their credentialing system is the universities. Out of 2,000 departments of communication, they couldn't find one conservative professor, not one. That's where we're at. This is the complacency of the right. All the Bill Cristols who sat on the boards of these universities and let this happen year after year. And it's not because they weren't told, because I told them personally, and it was obvious anyway from the treatment. Yeah, I spent 20 years going to about 400 colleges, and I had to take bodyguards to every one, just for talking like this.
What was your motivation for writing the book, and what do you want people to get out of it?
To try to save other people like myself. I mean, I was an idealistic kid. I happened to have communist parents, but communism is all built on this phony idealism. Communist Party, when Stalin was alive, was claiming before congressional committees that they were Jeffersonian Democrats. Oh, dear. me. So my mission was, and it's probable that almost no leftists read anything that I wrote. So my mission became one to conservatives. Don't be so nice. Don't save your enemy's embarrassment by telling the truth, which they do all the time. And the Democrats are calling our people, white supremacists, racists, whatever they call them, traitors, basically, enemies of democracy. And Republicans are calling them liberals. I mean, they're telling a big lie that protects their enemies.
All right, so the book is The Radical Mind, The Destructive Plans of the Woke Left. David Horowitz, thank you again for taking the time to talk with us today.
Thanks for having me, guys, and keep up the good work.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, Brian, that was a fascinating interview and an opportunity to hear the opinions of one of the great conservative culture warriors who has had a significant impact on traditional conservative thought in the United States from the 90s to the present. I thought he had some really interesting things to say. I'm looking forward to reading his book. What did you think?
Well, first, I wish we could have had more time with him because I would have liked to pick his brain on just so many other aspects of the world, really. But what a unique perspective he has, given he grew up with parents who were way on the left, and then he kind of converted almost from that mindset to the other side, and now he has this very pro-America, common sense approach to things, and he sees it. Like you said, he's fought the wars. He's seen American political discourse at its ugliest, and he's seen what the consequences are if we go down that path. And as relates to the border, his views were very much in line with a lot of the things we talk about every day.
Yeah, it's a fantastic interview. Thank you.
Yeah. Congratulations. You made it to the end of the podcast. If you liked what you saw today, you found it useful, hit the like button, subscribe, and share with your friends. If you'd like to learn more about the Immigration Reform Law Institute, go to irli.org. If you want to support the show and early, go to irli.org/podcast. You can also hear us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and other platforms. And don't forget to check us out on all the social media platforms as well. Thanks a lot.